Hello everyone. Since in the last days I made a video about the rise of the Italian signori and therefore the creation of lordships in communal Italy, today I thought to give some thought or possibly an explanation about how this process actually occurred, and stressing one aspect of this, that is how the rise to power of what seemingly and rhetorically appears like the figures of tyrants, essentially, or of lords, as a matter of fact, as of sole rulers of initially of just city regimes, and eventually something of something greater that encompassed even a regional scale, was actually not due to the mere imposition, violent and authoritarian imposition of these lords, but how the local communities actually pushed in more than one occasion, and we can even say systematically in the whole picture of communal Italy, the same rise of the lordship. Um, I was mentioning before the last video I made on the topic that really emphasized the very first lordships that, or better, experiments of lordship that actually occurred into especially northern Italy. If you're gonna want to check that out, the title of the video is the rise should be the rise of the. Just wait a second. Um, it's the first Italian lordships. Ezzerino da Romano, Umberto Pallavicino, and William the VII of Montferrat. Well, these figures, about whom I will definitely discuss again in the future, were like the first guys who tried that, as not just as Italian of single of lords of single cities, but also extending their lordship as a sovereign citizen rule. This is very meaningful because actually the most powerful lordships were the ones that managed to eventually have a solid center into one city. So paradoxically, these first seigneurial experiments were carried out because there were several cities that decided to formally be protected, especially from a military point of view, by these figures, but eventually not letting the same lords to eventually ground and root their basis of power within the same cities. So it's not that the lordship started really from one place. I mean, one place originally could call these people. We were largely, as I was saying in the video last time, coming largely from a feudal background. That is, essentially lords that had their own territories into the countryside, that it partly were already urbanized, as it was quite often the case in low medieval communal Italy. But let's say that they rarely stemmed from a citizen ground, and some of the most famous lordships were essentially an import inside the city. But today I would like to talk, skipping a bit of things, even temporarily speaking, about the eventual deep and wide spread of the lordship, as we can say, as even as a sort of an average institutional as an average, as a standard institution at a point in communal Italy, with some exceptions, because you can find a city like the one of Florence that always was proudly devoid of any form of tyranny theoretically, because even Florence eventually saw the rise of a lordship that wasn't conceived as such because of the we're talking about the Medici, of course, because the traditional republicanism of the city wouldn't allow such forms of power to be practically at least obstanced, but that definitely was in this case an exception, because Florence is in many ways a very particular city that had a very peculiar past, certain political and social dynamics that in this sense substantially differed from we can say almost the rest of communal Italy that had transformed itself in fact in seigneurial Italy. And by the way, Florence was essentially dominating into a very wide area of Tuscany, so practically imposing its own rule, not as a lord or as a tyrant, as the same Florentines would have called him, but as a republic, as a city republic, and which was doing essentially the same thing of the signori. The most powerful of the Italian lordships at this time was the Milanese one of the Visconti. The Visconti instead were producing a completely different ideology compared to Florence, probably completely opposite in the sense that they were praising their own tyranny. The Italians at this time were using the word tyrant essentially in the old neutral term that they encountered in the classical sources, into which indeed the idea of tyranny was out there, but the tyrant was actually a sort of institution that sometimes in the ancient during the times of Hellenism had basically achieved actually a lot in terms of the success of the local city, etc. So the Milanese were essentially saying there can't be an effective peace, because this was the actual concern, if there is not a sole ruler, if there is not tyranny in its neutral and even positive form. Now that I think about it, I made also a video that explains this, that these are all things that, since we're talking about Italy, you can find in the medieval Italy playlist that is among my playlists, so you can find all these contacts quite easily, even more easily than what I'm getting to use by myself right now. I'm searching for you the title. The title was Freedom and Tyranny in the Age of Humanism, Political Thought in Florence and Milan. Well, just check that out if you're interested, because in there I explain essentially the two visions between Salutati and Loschi, and respectively expressing Florentine republicanism and Milanese seigneurial rule. So even here, maybe without repeating myself, you can easily go see that is more dedicated. But we're still gonna talk about the Visconti, because the Visconti here are some of the most important, well, at least in European history, they were a very important force. They were, at least in central and northern Italy, definitely the most powerful force existing at this time. We are talking essentially from the mid of the 14th century here, even if the actual rise of the lordships took place in the first half of the 14th century into Italy. But we're naming the Visconti because they were the ones who, in a certain sense, managed to build up into northern Italy from Milan a very strong and structural and compact and centralized dominion, When I'm saying centralized, you don't have to think it as a modern state, but definitely Milan was the Italian lordship that pushed the most, pushed more in towards that direction. And this is very important because it has to take into consideration how, on which basis this lordship had spread. The Visconti rose to power in Milan into the second half of the 13th century, clashing continuously. They were Ghibellines, so they were pro-imperial, and the emperors backed them. Usually, because even Guelph and Ghibelline can mean many things, really. So you could find even Ghibellines clashing against the emperor. As a matter of fact, during the 14th century, if I'm not wrong, the Milanese actively fought against the empire in spite of all. Mainly because at that point the empire had bailed out of Italy, and therefore the Milanese at this point weren't many. They weren't a political pawn that could be used to make the Germanic Empire intrude into Italian affairs. It's kind of ironic. I made a video a few days ago that was about the Battle of Legnano, and thinking about how Milan had been kind of the symbol of Guelphism into Italy, that and eventually turned out to become one of the most clearly Ghibelline lordships eventually. And that tells you, by the way, even about how much there would be to say about the history of Milan in this sense, and how important it was in Italian and European affairs, and how the actual transformation took place in this sense, this perspective. And they rose to power from a relatively marginal position, because they were Visconti is a name that comes essentially from the Vice Comites that were in feudal Europe, in post-Carolingian Europe. Those basically those familiars of the lords that were doing the functions of counts, hence the name. Into maybe into a castle. Then maybe the count eventually died, but they retained the title, let's say, of vice counts in this sense. So it's not really a name that has a very deep mark of nobility attached to it, but it's still part of this broad Carolingian post-Carolingian aristocracy that was spreading there. And they came from outside Milan. They weren't even prominent family into the city. And however, thanks to the help of one of their relatives that had become Otto, the bishop of Milan, they managed to get a substantial amount of followers into the city, and to clash against the Della Torre family, or Torriani as you can also call them. They were instead Guelphs, and they had risen as lords of Milan themselves, even if we are still at an early stage of the development of lordship. So what it means by lord here, we will explain it later. It's something much lighter. It's essentially someone put in charge temporarily of the situation because he has many enemies. But the situation was quite unstable. In fact, the Visconti were bailed out, were banned eventually by Milan because defeated by the Tyranny. Then they came back and eventually managed, after decades of war, thanks to especially to Matteo Visconti, to eventually secure the Milanese lordship, and to start from Milan this expansion into northern Italy, which was quite fast, because essentially they had been fighting almost all the time around Milan, because the papal legatus had continuously fought into the surroundings of Milan. So once that um, resistance had been broken, eventually the Visconti spread all over Lombardy and extended their seigneury over many northern Italian cities, and even central Italian cities at one point. And this thing processed very and in the future, I mean, in the second half of especially of the 14th century, and then obviously even more in the 15th century with the regional states. Eventually, the Visconti went extinguished, and the last heiress was married to the Sforza, who started in this sense the Sforza dynasty, continuing into the Milanese lordship and domains. But that's another story. Today we're talking about the Visconti properly. And they had tended at that point to structure this very heterogeneous dominion of cities that were quite different. I mean, there is a substantial homogeneity in communal Italy in terms of political institutions and even the same political, social, and economical dynamics, but still, every place had its own story, its own traditions, etc. So what the Visconti tried was basically to standardize a bit everything, especially in terms of an administration, central administration with the cities, maybe being a bit more flexible with less powerful entities like, I don't know, the peasantry or other villages or rural entities, that including lords in turn, that existed in there. However, this thing happened at a later stage. Initially speaking, and we will take the Visconti as a sample here of how an Italian lordship basically rose, began really in fully institutional paths. This is one of the first characteristics on the rise of the lordships. It's not that they arrived and they imposed a new regime in terms of political the functioning of the political institutions. No, not at all. They arrived essentially as placed there by the people, and respecting the popular traditions. Obviously, bit by bit. I don't want to make it as if it was something nice and pink. The whole thing eventually evolved into these lords abusing of their power and structuring even the institutions in a way that were increasingly more obedient to them. But in this sense, this authoritarian means had been the same that the people had used once when they had kicked out, for instance, the knightly class. It was the average political dialectics that you found at the time, in the sense that a lord usually came in kicking out another lord and being supported by this or that popular faction, that family, that etc. So it would be normal to have bloodshed and war going on in this sense. But in today's context, the rise of the lords was instead sometimes very very smooth, without even an excessive amount of bloodshed, if not maybe of the maybe the very maybe the familiars of the other lords that maybe existed before, but not really making butchery of the population or of all the sides. On the contrary, taking a faction from your side, or maybe progressively using it as a political tool, especially when it had lost, so it grew dependent on your decision, was something very clever to do, even to counterbalance the power of those who placed you in charge, which was often the case. So just to make you understand how here, first of all, the it's not clear who was who here. Literally, I mean, who was the bad or good guy? Who was the good guy and the bad guy? It doesn't make any sense in practice, historically speaking, to do so. And I'm making this video also and especially because I realized that especially in the Anglosphere, um, every time, at least at a popular level, I'm not talking about academics and professionals that are quite good. I love British and American historiography. I have nothing against that in this sense. But in the Anglo-Saxon culture, let's say for historical reasons that include the Magna Carta and the English Civil War and all the religious problems attached, the American Revolution and all, there is this obsession, I would call it, of the tyrant. I mean, the average and this is what I get, especially when I see the average internet user coming from that cultural background, really placing himself or herself on the track of, I mean, the idea of who was the bad guy who did wrong and who was the good guy who did right. I come from a very different background, and although I feel very much for moral and ethical problems, like we don't have to make a relativism about this, it's sometimes very difficult and even very sad indeed that in history everyone was potentially the good or bad guy at one point. I mean, here political interests and dialectics, especially in such a politically fragmented situation like communal Italy could be, it was something normal. I mean, if you take the Kingdom of England, there was something unitary in theory. I mean, the idea at least of being a monarchy. It's obvious that you are all concerned already to reason in terms of who was at the time the king, was he good or bad, and stuff like that. And the general idea is, let's find the guilty guy. Let's find the guy who did wrong and that caused problems to the poor of the rest of the pure and tender people who lived so serenely and just thinking about so piously about their family, about their work and all. This is not really how it works. In all times in history there have been social classes and political entities and singular individuals that have always been fighting constantly against each other. I mean, I believe the history of the rise of democracies, of constitutionalism, is based exactly on that. I mean, there is you can read it all through a shift in balancement between the relations of strengths between the popular, I mean all the classes that made up society, and that evolved on the base of how rich they were, how powerful practically they were, how much they could impose themselves politically or militarily speaking. So when you read these parts of history, you have to get completely rid of idealistic proposals, because definitely the people back in the day had ideals and they pursued them, but most of these ideals are determined by other things, by other more material concerns that contributed to shape those same ideals. And even though ideals can definitely influence society and change in the world, every person is a product of his or her own times. So when I think of the judgment that there is about the tyrant equal bad person, no, this is not really so. I mean, at least here in the Middle Ages, things are often much more double-edged than you can imagine. There was no tyrant in the sense that everybody was the next tyrant, essentially, if you let him to. And the only way to avoid this was to become a tyrant yourself. and yeah, I know it sounds grim, it sounds negative, but let's try to understand why this happened. Most of all, and you'll be surprised to see that eventually there were people that had basically pushed for this, that had preferred sometimes to have a tyrant who maybe brought peace and order with a certain toll attached indeed, but still, better conditions to the ones you had been living in, and that therefore you could welcome like the lesser of evil and of bad things that could happen, and you would be satisfied with it. So this is really how you see uh, the Visconti in Milan, and creating their lordship, their signoria as it's called in Italian. They proceeded first of all with the transformation of the so-called elder of the people, or captain of the people, from an office that was normally uh, entrusted for a few months into a charge that could last more years. And could be renewed even at the same person for same person in a row, multiple times in a row, or even to the members of a same family. Um, and the In this sense, what we're doing was using offices. I don't know how you want to call them here, that were perfectly part of the institutional um, charges that were normally given to other people. You have to think that at this time communal Italy was also there was the podestà system, which was a political system that consisted in calling a general leader, who was usually a military leader, to deal with political, like mostly with public order, internal public order, and external military activities, while the rest of the commune would be kept being governed by the local councils that were made up of oligarchs, as always, even when they were popular. I mean, coming from the so-called popol, the people, that because the people in this sense was already stratified, so there were those who were more privileged, were at the top, and the others kind of followed. So it was an extremely variegated situation. So the Podestà system had already showed that certain the Podestà, by the way, were being all foreigner, in the sense that they came from another city, not from outside of Italy, but from another city, because those were the foreigners from the municipal perspective. And so to be theoretically impartial. Now the Lord arrives in in another fashion. First of all, the Podestà usually, from a certain point onwards, not having very um, strong local ties, unless they weren't imposed by a very strong, prominent city that were progressively expanding to on the city itself, where they sent their own podestà, were sometimes helpless in front of the local faction clashes. So they might side from one another in spite of their ideal impartiality, but they sometimes couldn't work. So there were lordships that came, by the way, when and maintaining the podestà, as a like a reassuring figure on the stress, in this sense, the continuity of the institutional norm, that the normal government that existed in the city, and obviously maybe even pushing for the election of that podestà, or um, are really doing the same functions. I studied, for instance, a lords in Parma that normally went into war together with the Podestà, obviously, because that was who was used to lead the army at that point, and the Lord would simply come with his own men, his own retinue, with him, and waging war, and with the Parmesan army, and yeah, being this presence that in a certain sense backed the work and of the same Podestà. So we can obviously that context is a bit. I mean, every city was really doing on its own. I mean, as I was saying, there is a certain homogeneity into this, but every city had a local tradition on its own in many ways. But this is just for saying that the first lords came with titles that were quite neutral, that weren't even practically um, elusive of their power. They were called just in sort of in a paternalistic fashion, in the sense that they were meant to first and foremost to preserve the peace of the community, because that was the first thing. The lords came from that reason, because at a certain point the city couldn't even rule itself. So sometimes a lord could be called even by the two opposed political parties. So not really because one eventually won on the other, but because it was evident that if situation had kept going on in that way, there was no other mean to call someone to a bit like the Podestà essentially had was doing. Usually lords were called also for reasons that had to do with military power. I mean, here we are in the phase of the decline of the so-called popolo, which originally was made up of the popular classes of the city, and that therefore was represented usually by the infantry, the commoners, all these artisans and craftsmen and all, who from the second half of 13th century, especially after the fall of the Hohenstaufen, had managed to kind of get rid of the knightly class that was usually siding from the imperial side. They represented this kind of very aggressive class, from which eventually the same lords would come back in a way, because these were the landed nobility in many ways, and so they were expelled by the popolo, but they kept existing into the countryside, into the city district, and still interacting with the popolo at some time. But the popolo was absolutely incapable of military activity. I mean, these classes weren't made up of the militaries, of the knights that they had exiled or maybe subjected and restricted in their military power. So the popolo soon wasn't capable of waging war, because all they thought about was their own shop, about their own trade. Therefore, they didn't spend time fighting or training with horses and all. Obviously, the cream of the popolo had its own knightly and chivalric ambitions as well, because in Italy the knightly class was maintained in the sense that it was a sensual, it was on the base of sensus. I mean, if you were rich enough, you not only you could in practice, but you had to, because of the commune's laws. You had to serve as a mounted knight, so you had to contribute to the collective. But the popolo in this sense was unexperienced. So at a certain time, especially when fighting against the first lordships, including the Visconti, by the way, many popular cities eventually had to call against call a lord. It's true that many of these cities were even directly militarily conquered by a lord, but it's nevertheless true that many of these actually entrusted themselves into the hands of another lord, who was usually, as we were saying, a feudal a lord already with his own retinues, being of knightly class, of having military experience, and therefore saying, okay, we entrust you certain powers, and you please use them to defeat our enemy now. The main consequence actually was the renewed routing of the lordships into the city, into the cities, into the communes, and this happened really naturally, in the sense that if you were one of these feudal lords that lived into to the city districts, you already had you weren't a stranger, you weren't an external foreigner that nobody had ever seen, like a podesta. You were someone who, you know, traded with the city, who had connections in the city, who lived sometimes in the city, because these nobles might have been kind of limited in their own ambitions, but they could and did often come to the city and have so, and everything was, I'm kind of schematizing here, but the world, you can imagine how progressive and modulated this practically was, in the sense that you can't say that here from one moment this thing happened and then another. When you study communal Italy, I believe on the major manuals, communal Italy is not very much studied in the West, as at the point of becoming a topic of popular knowledge. But usually when you get in the chapter of the Italian communes, you read this scansion like first there were the consuls, then the podesta, then lords, as if it was something that came straight in that order. Really not, and even the rise of the lords happened, and usually that is not written in manuals. It happened for the most intricate connections and relations that existed within the communal society in itself. We're talking about the most advanced urban centers in the world at this point, when thinking about the Italian communes. So you can imagine, even from a financial point of view, how many interests, how many logics would be necessary to carry out at a certain point. And all this into an environment like the first half of 14th century Italy that was marked by continuous warfare. Continuous. And it's interesting because the lordships actually rose at this point, even in their at their territorial base on a regional scale, in the sense that if you look at a map of Italy from at the beginning of the 14th century and the half of the 14th century, it's as if you said, oh, but this changed all, like in 50 years. Yes, and even less, like in things like 20, 30 years, uh, you literally have the political map of Italy being made up by all these many dots that you can't even understand, each one being an independent city-states, and at the end of the period finding already the major regional states basically formed in their essentials. Obviously you have to read that and in a certain way. It's not that a centralized state was formed. I explained this in another video that it's interesting to you, the origins of Italian regional states, that talks exactly about this. And that offers already here a positive picture of the lords, in the sense that this happened largely because the empire and the papacy and the Angevins kind of backed out of Italy. They regressed. They lost their grip on central and northern Italy, that were the cradle of the communal civilization. And therefore, what happened, instead of you know mm, increasing further fragmentation, what happened is that these lords were able instead to create something more solid, something like a common base. The whole thing could have exploded, like in Germany. In Germany, in the same period, very same period, after the end of the Swabians, what you have is that the central power, represented by the German monarchy, basically weakens, it shrinks, and as a consequence, the political map of Germany gets like a terrible mess, that like it already was before, but even more complicated. I mean, even there were certain dynasties that managed to create something more compact around them, but it took much more time, in spite they being much more, on average, much more powerful uh, than at least the average Italian lordship, in the sense the Italian lordships were extremely powerful. Like if you take the La Scala dynasty in the 30s of the 14th century, was the second power in Europe after the Kingdom of France, in terms of military capabilities. So, but what happens in Italy instead is that from something that was extremely fragmented, there you turn into something that was very compact, very or at least revolving against around a singular power that was usually a city, like in the Visconti case, the one of Milan, as we were saying, and that kind of functioned like a single body. Although we will see now how the whole thing went. So what happened with in Milan with the elder of the people, or the captain of the popolo, was actually repeated in with different names in other in the case of other lordships. The certain lords, as a matter of fact, in communal Italy, would become so with the charge of podestà. There were even podestà that eventually became lords, or at least lords that assumed the title of podestà. It was a hell of a title in this sense, and that, as I was saying, stressed the military duties, and in this and even the control on public security. In fact, you can understand how subtle this is, because usually the podestà had originally, at least, it was originally intended to say, okay, let's keep order in the city, in the sense that nobody can do harm, etc. Now the lords were doing the same thing, but really eventually disarming the people, and therefore assuring public order, which was assured. This is important. This is why I was telling to you, these tyrants in practice achieved in a world that had been like a continuous urban battle against factions, violence, fires, destructions, city battles and all. They simply took everybody off. Like, this is what happened, by the way, also in the Roman Republic. I mean, the civil wars and all these problems. Then Augustus arrives, or solves the problem, and creates de facto a Roman monarchy, by the way, which was something very different in ideal and institutional terms in this sense, but still basically a monarchy in the sense that it was one man that practically um, was in charge of the situation. Other titles instead that you can find were, as we've seen, the elder of the people, the general captain, that maybe stressed a little bit the idea of being ahead, especially from a military point of view. I mean, the captain, especially of was a title that echoed into the popular tradition. The captain of the people was the guy who was in charge of guiding the people, the popular militia, and that had usually, in this sense, been opposed internally into the city to the knights, who were the military men by pro excellence, and that in this sense were countered eventually by a, a captain of the people that was intended to stop all the mobster violence that the knightly class basically carried out into the city streets, and therefore was intended also here in order to let the craftsmen and those, the middle classes to keep freely their business opened without the risk of finding themselves into a city battle because two noble families wanted to eat their guts. And in this sense, another hint, another evidence of wishing for public order, for justice to be made, because the captain of the people was famous in this sense because they even began to not just of contrasting the knightly class, but also of legislating, of promoting laws for which the knights didn't have to battle into the city. The people was rightfully had to be rightfully called into arms when things happened to enforce security and all. And there are even more ideological and angelical names like the Preserver of Peace, indeed, or even though you can find even Lord. The average was Dominus in Latin, because these were usually the Italians were already writing in vernacular this time, as any expert about medieval literature perfectly knows, given the caliber of people like Dante or Petrarch, etc. in this context. But they in this sense there was bilingualism. You can find the Latin title together with the vernacular one. The Latin one belonging to an administrative tradition that was used to write in Latin, so it was the language of the notaries, of the jurists of law, indeed, of the universities of law and all. So what is important here to stress is that the lords rose to power to stop violence. So this is the greatest provocation, because the idea is, these lords came on with armed bands and all. Well, who didn't at the time, really? Because the populace was armed and clashed. The knights were armed and clashed. Who wasn't there armed and clashing? So why did the lords had to arrive unarmed to do what exactly? So and if you see, as I was saying before, if you in the very moment into which the Lord actually rose to power, there are occasions in which there is not even a need for bloodshed. I mean, the authority of this Lord was eventually characterized by the presence of a military retinue that was quite often a private one. So usually counterposed to the public one of the popolo or the commune in general, which is very interesting in this sense. But that was called into that place after, for instance, another occasion into which the lords could arrive to power was a great military defeat. I mean, the popolo, as we were saying, was practically incapable of fighting for a long time. It happened that it got defeated, and the commune simply said, "Okay, we are done, because we don't have, we don't have resources. The enemies seize the city, so let's entrust the city to a lord that has military experience and forces. Even in the case of Parma, this is kind of ridiculous, but it's even smart in this sense. Um, you have to think of conflicts being fought here very overlapped. Parma was at times at war with several lords or other cities, and at a certain point the Parmesan people clashed against a Parmesan lord that had been exiled into the city district and that was waging war against the city to re-enter into the city. There was a huge battle into which basically no side won because the lord won in open field, but he and the people were defeated. But the lord was not so strong, albeit victorious, to enter into the city. So what they did, the Popolo asked the same lord that had defeated them to come temporarily as a lord of the city, because in the meanwhile there was a third enemy out there that was were the Visconti, by the way. The Visconti were really framing, really sneaking into everywhere at this point because they were building up their own lordship and fighting jointly against. And you find the lord together with the people that goes out there and carry out military expeditions. I mean, it's all this complicated. It's all this level of continuous changing of the situation, a completely fluid system into which you had to really invent the unimaginable in order to survive. Parma didn't make it because eventually the Visconti got it, but the Visconti are kind of great. They were, by the way, great fighters, great knights, great military men. Like they literally spent their whole life on horseback, clashing against this or that city. You can't imagine, you can feel, especially reading the sources, how used these people were to fight, how intense, especially that very period of the first half of the 14th century was animated from a military point of view. But as I was saying, what is of incredible importance here is to see that the Lord was called. The Lord didn't arrive to impose over the pure poor people who was so virtuous in democratic values. No, it was the same people that asked for being ruled. Obviously, this was what happened de facto, although the people, if they had been strong enough, obviously he would have never called the Lord or anyone for that matter to be ruled by. So it's obvious in here that the people was kind of losing in a certain sense, but it was losing to so many factors that the one of the singular one of the lordship of the Lord wasn't the overall cause. So even the same relations between the Popolo and the lords was initially kind of positive, was cooperative in many ways. So, and you have to think, as I was saying, that normally factions try to rise to power by fighting. So the lords in this sense weren't really using violence more than the average at all. And as we've seen in some cases, they didn't even need to use it. And especially the popular engagement into regime changes could happen quite easily. I mean, here we have seen situations of war of extreme difficulty, like prolonged warfare and all. But it could happen that in more peaceful moments, the populace simply decided that they didn't like the lord that much, so they basically called another lord. They organized jointly a coup d'etat, and this guy entered into the city walls. This is how it happened. He killed physically the lord with his family, and that's it. I mean, no other blood was shed. And this is, for instance, how the Gonzaga rose to power into Mantua. This is, I mean, there are countless examples, but importance here is the meaning that proves that. And by the way, this is also a um, the why at a point even so much need for the people to call these, because they were tired of fighting. They didn't want to do war. There is a chronicle that was written by a Dominican friar in Milan that was a very pro Visconti source, and that um, was stressing essentially the wealth of Milan under the Visconti and all the great things. I mean, like how many, I don't know, how many markets, how many churches, how many goods were in Milan at a certain point. It's very interesting because it also makes a list about certain craftsmen that we can't know how many there were in Milan at the time. Obviously, it's a kind of glorification of the city, but it's still very meaningful. And he explicitly said that Milanese people were happy about the Visconti being there because the Visconti had basically um, allowed them not to participate to the military duties of the city, because the city normally required, on the base of census, as we were saying, everyone who could go to war, essentially to go there. Obviously, it was nobody actually. I mean, um, not all the citizens actually went to war. Not even all the male adults. There was always a selection, several quarters that went maybe for 2 weeks into military service, then giving coming back, and the other quarters went to continue the duty and all. So it was already a situation towards which the people was they didn't care about war. The people, the craftsmen didn't care about war. He didn't. He cared all about his craft and about his money. So what this source is saying, it's obviously pro tyranny, we can't say, but it is true. I mean, we know from many other communal Italian cities that this was the reason. The people didn't want to go to war anymore. They didn't want to spend their own wealth for equipping themselves, staying out of their shops for a prolonged time, for waging wars, and maybe they weren't even resolutive, and that maybe just the nobles liked to do because they could at least raid with the horses and all, at least with a prominent role. And they didn't want to fight. So these guys were seemingly acclaiming the Visconti for having let them, obviously lost their political autonomy, but letting them essentially free to do what they liked. And think that Milan had seen quite of an intense troubles, during the clashes between the Torriani and the Visconti. So once the Visconti set things right, they got the city, and they let it go. I mean, peacefully. I mean, not they let it go. I mean, they made it go peacefully, being pacified. All the people were happy, and obviously, then the Visconti were a bit more clever, because what they actually did was to appease the most important merchants and bankers of Milan by eventually using their own their financial wealth in order to invest into war, into expansion, and making the Milanese bankers entering into those cities that the Visconti conquered, and therefore increasing their own profits, and therefore it was a mutual benefit. I mean, and this is how usually happened. The lords basically functioned because the city oligarchies were for him. And this is what you find in many other contexts. So I don't want to paint it as if the lords were actually good people, but as I was saying, they weren't maybe the worst option at all. It was better to have a lord than prolonged and unceasing and continuous warfare into the streets. um, the being tired of war. In the Italian chronicles of the time, what you see is that let's stop war. Like in many other places and times in history, like we are tired of war. I think most of the people who listen to my videos hopefully haven't experienced war in the first place. I mean, they didn't have. I'm sure, here close to home we have countries like the Ukraine, like, that they actually have war into their garden, home garden, we can say. But generally speaking, I don't know what war is. Most of you do not know what war is, if not from television, from history books and all. But the idea of living through a war and not really knowing. I think the worst thing is not the actual violence or suffering that you undergo to, but what I think it's the instability, the fact that in such a violent times, in such you can't even plan your life. You can't think of yourself in a few even a few months because maybe you'll be dead, you know. And those who pushed in this sense the most for the pacification were the merchants because war and sometimes does get along with financial operations, as we've seen in the relation between the Visconti and the bankers, but not if it is in your house. So obviously, you don't want you want your house to be pacified and to make money from there. Then maybe waging war somewhere else, but I'd say at least pushing it away. And this is what they practically did. So the whole thing would proceed quite sneakily in many ways. It would be very progressive. I mean, the people in itself weren't. As we've seen, we said that they weren't much good for war in the sense that they weren't much good for prolonged military operations. But the people was still dangerous in the cities, and you couldn't wipe it out because, first of all, the lords didn't have the strength sometimes, not even in their case, especially at the beginning of the period. Secondly, because the people was in practice the wealth, the working force, the property owners of all the wealth that the signori actually could live off in practice. So and plus an army of infantrymen like the one of the Popolo was extremely dangerous into urban warfare, because cavalry in open field could butcher down. By the way, the lords made an extensive use of mercenary cavalry, in this sense, because they by disarming the people, they obviously pointed on not on creating an armed class into the city or strengthening it at all. They usually had a lot of money and they used it to buy mercenaries. By the way, were also more effective in military speaking, and being largely horsemen at this point. Very often foreigner, usually German, and this is how the dawn of the condotte actually as a period. But a people that rose up in the streets could block literally. There is a lot about urban warfare into this phase, as we were saying. And what you see is that once you're bottled down into a street with guys that throw you crossbow bolts and are pretty heavily armored, because even these populars had they were stratified in the sense that there were a few elite even in the but they owned a lot of wealth, so they could maybe arm all their clients. And sometimes we have in a clash in Florence against the Duke of Athens, Walter of Brienne, that eventually died at Poitiers. It says that the Popolo was so well armed that basically they were armed all like as if they were knights, full knights with barbute, and this is very meaningful. I mean, how can you stop a popolo? You know, you have to really fight house for house, and you don't have the strength. You can be the best knight, the best professional mercenary fighter, but you know, even if you take out 20, there are like other 100 meeting you, so you can't make it. So it would take a very long time before the lords eventually managed to fully control the populations, and this happened over the centuries, we can say, not even through the decades. I mean, it's something that there is even a lot of studying about the transformations in urbanism, all the towers or all the dungeons, the strongholds that the lords began to build into the um, key places of the city to better control the streets, the bridges, all the all the idea of controlling the citizenship and progressively blocking with chains the main square. That was usually the place where the main urban warfare usually took place, and it was usually also the square into which the public palace of the government stood. So all a very slow process that in this sense went so slow together with the political and institutional transformation. It's not that the Lord arrived and everything was like it changed from one day to another. It was definitely something much more, you know, progressive in many ways. So um, uh, even the adaptation of the local communities on to the lordship was actually there, because as we were saying, by the way, these lordships tended to expand um, towards towards on other cities to create multi city governments with multi-city lordships, sovereign citizen domain, basically dominions. Sorry, and this meant that obviously the central city was privileged over the others. By the way, what in the case of the Visconti, what happened was that they even part of the success that they of their territorial expansion was extremely rapid and extremely aggressive, basically managing to even to occupy Genoa, to enter into Tuscany, to arrive on the Adriatic Sea. I mean, conquering almost all of northern and central Italy at one point was something feasible just because certain cities accepted their own rule, even as a decentralized government. So um, it would happen quite easily, by the way, that when one of the Visconti family died, I mean the family had died, usually um, um, these dominions evaporated because they were tied to these kind of personal rules, and the more distant the city was, and the practically the more difficult um, the lordship could be actually imposed on the city. So obviously the cities in Lombardy proper were much more tied to Milan, to the Visconti lordship. This is important because the two things were intermingled. Um, but there was still, we're not at, we are at the threshold of the modern era in the construction of centralized states, but this style form being still very decentralized. I mean, every city that was under the lordship had its own pacts with the Visconti. that were renewed. I mean, the cities that were under these guys really still believed theoretically that they were free, that their political autonomy was something they could play on. Then in practice, they were already lost in the sense that if they had eventually bowed to that lordship and not maybe having created one of their own, because this could have happened, and there were even mono citizen um, single city lordships. But if the Visconti in this case had managed to extend their power on them, it was because at a certain point they couldn't oppose themselves, militarily speaking. But the idea was that as soon as the lordship crumbled for any reason, dynastic problems, other enemies arriving, even from out of Italy, etc., these cities could still, take back part of their autonomy, or maybe falling into another lordship that maybe was more distant, so they could play on a frontier area and developing. Think about the Gonzaga in Mantua, and in this sense played very much their first of all their geographical location over the rivers that were river crossings into the Po Valley was a key area of passage for armies and all, but also because they were fairly distant from Milan and relatively close to Venice, enough to play between the two rivals. So these were all. This was really the degree, and you can understand how dishomogeneous this was, and how unstable in practice it really was, and how nominal in practice it really was in certain cases. Although we must say that indeed these dominions were quite formidable, especially very wealthy, because they extended themselves over the wealthiest urban centers of Europe, so they could draw a huge amount of money that not even feudal kingdoms had at this time, through which they could buy mercenaries and to field very big armies for the time standards, and keep doing that. And it was a continuous balance, a continuous, trying to weaken your enemy, to strengthen yourself continuously. So, however, this is more or less what I wanted to say. I hope I was clear. Personally, I like very much the history of the Visconti in Milan, because I don't know. I'm really pro lordship rather than pro popular. If from which side do I lean? Well, I definitely lean more for the side of tyranny than the side of democracy. No, well, I'm kidding. Of course, I'm a fully democratic person in my own times. But indeed, if looking at least at how, for what we can understand history at the beginning of the 14th century, definitely I would have preferred to live under the Visconti in Milan, that probably under the maybe under the Florentines. I don't know. I might have also liked to live among the Florentines, who were wealthier individually, but even there were substantial problems. I don't know, but just for saying that, really for making you understand that these lords weren't that enormously worse as a form of government than other forms of government. And to me, this is really crucial to understand the rise of the lordship, because we're not talking about times in which the state, like dictators, had this in mass society into the 20th century, the ability of really wiping out millions of people just with a snap, and imposing their own rule with their own armies and all. I mean, these were times in which the state had a very low coercive power. So if these regimes actually made it to create such dominions, it was really because there was a participation of the communities that deemed this these rulers to be better than other forms of government. Indeed, and this is what I mostly want to stress. But we will extensively talk about the Italian lordships also in the future. So, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like. Or if you like, you can also subscribe to my channel so that you can receive further news about my videos. For now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.